There is a question that has haunted every civilization that has ever drawn breath, every people who ever looked up at the dome of the night sky and felt, for just a moment, the terrifying privilege of being alive. It is not a question asked in words, exactly, it is felt more than spoken, a tremor beneath thought, a pull beneath language. It is the question that rises in the chest when you stand at the edge of something vast, an ocean, a desert, a horizon swallowed by storm, and it goes something like this. Where did all of this come from? And before all of this, what was there? Most of us, in our modern lives, have learned to set that question aside. We fill our hours with noise and motion, with the bright distractions of the living world, and we let the ancient ache of it go unanswered. But there were people, a civilization that endured for more than 3,000 years along the banks of a single, miraculous river, who refused to look away, who stared into that darkness with open eyes, and who built, over centuries and millennia, one of the most elaborate, most beautiful, most deeply human answers to that question the world has ever known. Those people were the ancient Egyptians. And their answer was not a philosophy, not a theorem, not a dry cosmological model scratched on a chalkboard. Their answer was a story. Many stories, in fact, stories that intertwined and contradicted and enriched one another, stories populated by gods who felt desire and jealousy and grief, by forces of nature given voice and face and name, by a universe that was not a cold mechanical engine, but a living, breathing drama as full of love and betrayal and resurrection as any human life. To enter the world of Egyptian mythology is to enter a kind of thinking that feels at once utterly foreign and surprisingly familiar, because at its heart, it is doing what all myth does. It is trying to make the unbearable manageable. It is trying to give shape to chaos. It is trying to explain why the sun rises every morning, why the river floods and recedes and floods again, why we are born and why we die, and whether death, truly, is the end of us. These are not small questions. And the Egyptians did not offer small answers. But before we can understand the gods, before we can follow Ra across the burning arc of the sky, before we can grieve with Isis as she searches the banks of the Nile for the shattered pieces of her beloved husband, we have to go further back. Much further back. Back before the gods themselves existed. Back before light. Back before the very idea of distinction, of separation, of one thing being different from another. We have to begin in the dark. Imagine the absence of everything. Not a dark room, not a starless sky. Those are still things, still spaces with dimension and edge. What we are reaching for is something more radical than darkness. Something more extreme than emptiness. The ancient Egyptians called it none, and it was not a place. It was not even a void, in the way we might understand a void as an empty container waiting to be filled. None was the complete and total absence of any distinction whatsoever. No up, no down. No here, no there. No before, no after. No light and no darkness, because to have darkness, you would need the idea of light to define it against. In none, there was no such opposition. There was only the thing itself, boundless, purposeless, eternal, water-like in the way that ancient peoples often described formlessness, but not water in any sense a human hand could touch. The Egyptians described none as the primordial waters. And this is worth pausing on, because it tells us something important about how they saw the nature of existence. Water, to an ancient Egyptian, was the most fundamental metaphor for raw, undifferentiated potential. It has no fixed shape of its own. It assumes the shape of whatever contains it. It can be still or violent, life-giving or annihilating. And crucially, it existed in Egypt in a very specific and mysterious form, the inundation. Every year, with an almost supernatural regularity, the Nile would rise. It would swell and darken and spread across the land, swallowing fields and boundaries and roads, returning the entire floodplain to something that looked, in those weeks of deep flood, uncannily like the primordial ocean. Everything flat and featureless, water in every direction, the land below and the pale sky above, and the thin, wobbling line of the horizon the only boundary between them. And then, as the waters receded, the first dark shapes would emerge. Small hills of rich black silt barely above the waterline. And on those hills, first nothing, then a trembling of green. life returning, order reasserting itself from the waters of chaos. Year after year, reliably, miraculously. This annual drama, this emergence of the world from the flood, was not just a seasonal event to the Egyptians. It was a reenactment, a living repetition of the first morning of the universe. Every year the world was, in a sense, created again. So when their priests and philosophers and storytellers sought to describe the beginning of all things, they reached naturally for the image they knew: water without limit, formlessness without end. None. In none, before time began, there was a kind of latency, a potential, a coiled readiness. And that potential had a name, though it had not yet spoken it. That name was Adam. The story of Adam, and it is important to understand that we are dealing here primarily with what scholars call the Heliopolitan tradition, the cosmology developed and preserved in the great sun city of Heliopolis. The city the Egyptians called Unu, the pillar. The story of Adam is one of the most extraordinary acts of theological imagination in the ancient world. Because Adam did not come from somewhere. There was no somewhere for him to come from. Adam arose. He became. He was, in his most essential nature, the act of self-creation itself. The Egyptians gave him many names, many epithets. He was called Adam Ra, linking him immediately to the solar principle. He was described as the self-created one, the all, the complete. His name itself, Adam, contains this beautiful double meaning. It can be read as both completeness and non-being, a paradox that the Egyptians seem to have embraced deliberately. He was everything and nothing at once. He was the totality of what existed folded into a single point of consciousness floating in the dark waters. And then, and this is the moment that the Heliopolitan creation myth circles back to again and again, the moment it treats with something approaching reverence, Adam willed himself into existence. Some texts say he rose from the waters as the first mound, the Benven, the sacred primordial hill, the form that would be echoed for millennia in the shape of Egyptian pyramids, those vast stone mountains rising from the desert floor. Some say he manifested as light, a burst of golden fire in the absolute blackness of none, the first light the universe had ever known. Some say he spoke, and the vibration of his voice was the first sound, the first disturbance of the absolute silence, and from that sound the world began to differentiate. What all versions agree on is this: something chose to be. In the middle of an eternity of undifferentiated nothingness, something, call it consciousness, call it will, call it the deep grain of the universe pressing toward complexity, something decided to exist. And in that decision, in that first act of differentiation, the process we call creation had begun. This is not a small idea. Modern cosmologists speak of the Big Bang, that first incomprehensible moment when from a state of infinite density and zero space, the universe exploded into being. The physicists are honest about the limits of their models. They can trace the history of the cosmos back to a fraction of a second after the beginning, but that very first moment, that threshold point, remains genuinely opaque to mathematics. Before the beginning, they tell us, the laws of physics as we know them simply did not apply. There was no time. There was no space. There was, and here their language gets unexpectedly poetic, there was a quantum foam, a sea of potential, a superposition of all possible states. The Egyptians, 5,000 years ago, looked at the same horizon and called it none. And they said something stirred in the deep. And that something was Adam. Now Adam, alone on his primordial mound, had a problem. The nature of existence had just been established, but it was terribly lonely. And more practically, a universe composed of a single conscious entity is not really a universe at all. It lacks everything that makes existence interesting: distinction, relationship, tension, change. To create a cosmos, you need at minimum two things. And Adam, inventive from the very first, found a way. What happened next is told in the Egyptian texts with a frankness that has startled scholars throughout the centuries of Egyptology, though perhaps it should not be startling at all. Adam, alone in the primordial darkness, pleasured himself. He brought himself to climax. And from that act, from the desire of the first god for creation, from the physical fact of his longing made manifest, came the first two divine children. He spat them out, some texts say. He sneezed them into existence, others claim. Still others are explicit and unapologetic. His seed was the source of the first emanations. And those emanations, those two divine principles that burst forth from the self-pleasing God at the dawn of time, were Shu and Tefnut. Shu was air. Tefnut was moisture. And the Egyptians were sophisticated enough in their cosmological thinking to understand why these two particular principles had to come first. Air and moisture are the preconditions for everything else. Before there can be plants or animals or people, before there can be earth or fire or sky, there must be the medium through which life will exist. There must be breath. There must be water. In the deep logic of Egyptian creation theology, Adam's first act of generation was not arbitrary, it was the most essential creative act possible. The universe, in ordering itself, reached first for the two things without which nothing living could ever follow. Shu and Tefnut were divine twins, and in the tradition, they are inseparable, not just as siblings, but as complementary principles, as the two polarities of a single atmospheric reality. Where Shu is dryness, Tefnut is wetness. Where Shu is space, Tefnut is substance. They are the first and most fundamental polarity in the created world, and their relationship, their tension, and their union will become the engine of everything that follows. But first, something nearly catastrophic happened. Adam, newly self-created and alone in the void, had brought his children into existence through an act of will so intense it had actually cost him something. Some versions of the myth say Adam lost Shu and Tefnut in the darkness of none, that the two divine children, newly born into formlessness, drifted away from their father, lost in the undifferentiated waters. And Adam, desperately alone, sent out his eye, his divine seeing, his consciousness focused into a point, later personified as the fierce solar eye, the Uriah serpent that coils at the brow of every pharaoh, to search for them. Here we encounter one of the most emotionally resonant images in all of Egyptian mythology, the god of creation, the self-born one, the all-complete, waiting alone in the dark for the return of his children. It is a moment of genuine pathos, and it is striking that the Egyptians put it at the very beginning of their cosmos, that their creation story is threaded from the very first moment with the fear of loss, with the tender anguish of a parent separated from their young. This is not the cold mathematics of cosmological model building. This is theology that bleeds. Eventually, and time has no real meaning yet, because time itself has not been created, Adam's I found Shu and Tefnut and brought them home. And when he saw them again, the god of everything wept. His tears fell into the dark, and where they fell, something new appeared. People. The first human beings, born from the tears of the self-created God at the moment of his reunion with his lost children. This, too, is a remarkable idea. The Egyptians did not imagine humans as the crowning achievement of creation, placed at the top of a hierarchy as lords of the universe. They imagined humans as a kind of afterthought, almost, as something that happened as a byproduct of divine emotion. We are the tears of a God who thought he had lost everything and found it again. We are joy and relief and the overflow of love made physical. There is something almost unbearably tender in that cosmological position, and something humbling too. We are incidental. We are the residue of feeling. And yet we are sacred, because we come from the body of the most sacred thing of all. Shu and Tefnut did not remain children. Gods grow differently than mortals, or rather, growth in the divine realm is less about time than about becoming. Shu and Tefnut became themselves, fully and completely, and in becoming themselves, they did what the gods would do again and again throughout the Egyptian mythological imagination. They came together, and they created new existence. Their union produced two children, and with the birth of these children, the universe gained its fundamental shape. Geb was born, and he was the earth. Nut was born, and she was the sky. And if Shu and Tefnut were the two first poles of atmospheric reality, then Geb and Nut were the two poles of spatial reality, the floor and ceiling of the cosmos, the below and the above, the solid and the infinite. Now here is where the Egyptians revealed themselves as something more than myth-makers. Here is where their theology becomes genuinely cosmological in its sophistication. Because Geb and Nut, at their birth, were locked in an embrace so absolute, so total, that there was no space between them. Earth and sky pressed against each other, merged, inseparable. And in that pressed-together state, nothing could exist between them. No room for air. No room for light. No room for life of any kind. Into this too-close embrace came Shu, their father, and this is one of those images that the Egyptians depicted again and again in their temple art, on their sarcophagi, in the painted ceilings of their tombs. Shu, the god of air, is shown standing between the earth and sky pressed against each other, merged, inseparable. And in that pressed-together state, nothing could exist between them. No room for air. No room for light. No room for life of any kind. Into this too-close embrace came Shu, their father, and this is one of those images that the Egyptians depicted again and again in their temple art, on their sarcophagi, in the painted ceilings of their tombs. Shu, the god of air, is shown standing between the earth and the sky, arms raised, holding them apart. He has stepped between his own children, forced himself into the space where no space was, and with the sheer divine force of his being, with the fundamental nature of air, which fills every void and creates distance and breathability, he has separated them. Geb, the earth, remained below, face down in the dark, and his body became the land. The hills and valleys of the world are the shape of his body, the contours of his limbs and ribs and spine. He is painted green, the color of growing things, because from him all plant life springs. He is sometimes shown ithyphallic, his sexual arousal pointed upward toward not the sky, because the earth does not stop desiring the sky simply because they have been separated. That desire is what drives growth, the reaching of every root, every stem, every green thing pressing upward toward the light above. Nut, the sky, arched above him. She is one of the most beautiful and strange images in all of Egyptian religious art. A woman so elongated she becomes the horizon, her fingertips touching the earth at one end of the world, her toes at the other. Her belly the dome of the sky and her body spangled with stars. She is both a goddess and an architectural fact. She is the roof of the world. And she and Geb ache for each other across the space that Shu holds between them. But the separation of earth and sky did something necessary. It created the space in between, the room in which the world, and everything in it, could exist. Shu stands in that gap forever, holding the architecture of the cosmos open with his bare arms, and his act of separation is simultaneously an act of creation. Space becomes possible. Air fills it. Life becomes thinkable. Within this space, within this newly opened cosmos, Ra would travel. Light would move. The great drama of existence would unfold. And yet there was more to come. Because Nut the sky was pregnant, and what she carried would change everything. There is, woven through the Egyptian mythological tradition, a beautiful and strange story about the days of the year, about the origin of time itself, and about why the world is the way it is rather than some other way. It involves Nut and Geb, but also a third party, a god named Thoth, who is the divine intelligence, the keeper of magic and writing and the deepest secrets of the cosmos, the ibis-headed or baboon-headed scribe of the gods who recorded everything that had ever happened and everything that would. And it involves Ra, the sun god who would become in time the supreme deity of the Egyptian pantheon, whose power was so great and whose knowledge so complete that he was, in a very real sense, the organizing principle of the entire created universe. Ra, it is said, had issued a decree. Or rather, Ra had spoken and his speaking was law, because he was the divine word made solar fire, and what he said became true. His decree stated that Nut could not give birth on any day of any month of any year. The reasons given vary. Some sources say Ra feared the power of Nut's children, feared what they might become, feared that they would one day surpass him. Other sources suggest it was a punishment, that Nut had transgressed in some way, had lain with Geb against divine ordinance, that the separation of earth and sky had been supposed to be permanent, but desire had overcome it. Whatever the reason, the decree stood. and Nut was pregnant with 5 children, and she could not deliver them. Into this impossibility stepped Thoth. Thoth, whose love of solutions was matched only by his love of games, went to the moon, Khonsu, the lunar god, and challenged him to a game of Senet, the great board game of ancient Egypt. The game that appeared in tombs not merely as entertainment, but as a metaphor for the journey through the underworld, for the negotiation between fate and will, for the strategy required to navigate the treacherous passages of existence. And Thoth gambled, and he won. Not once, not twice. Thoth played Khonsu again and again, and from each victory, he collected a prize that had never been wagered before, a fraction of moonlight. From all those winnings, Thoth accumulated enough borrowed light to make 5 new days, 5 days that stood outside the calendar, outside the 360 days that Ra's decree governed, intercalary days that the Egyptians called the epigomenal days, the days beyond the year. The calendar had been made by Ra, and Ra's decree applied only to that calendar. But Thoth, with the infinite patience and precision of the god of wisdom, had found the gap in the law. On days that did not technically exist, Nut could give birth freely. And so she did. On the first of the 5 extra days, Osiris was born and the universe trembled. On the second, Horus the Elder was born. On the third, Set came into the world, and his coming was violent. Some say he burst through the side of his mother in his impatience and hunger for existence, and the violence of his birth was the first announcement of what he would become. On the 4th day, Isis was born, and the world became, for the first time, a place capable of wisdom and love combined. On the 5th day, Nephthys was born, the quieter twin, the dark mirror of Isis, the goddess of the threshold and the edge of things. 5 births, 5 days. And the 5 children of Geb and Nut would become the central characters of the most dramatic story Egyptian mythology ever told. But before we arrive at that story, before we follow the arc of tragedy and love and resurrection that lies ahead, we need to understand the world that these gods were born into, and the cosmic machinery that gave that world its shape, its rhythm, its meaning. By the time Osiris and Isis and Set were born, the universe had acquired structure. There was none below everything, still there, still vast, still formless, the primordial waters pressing eternally at the edges of the created world like an ocean presses at the hull of a boat. The Egyptians never forgot that their ordered cosmos was surrounded by chaos. Their word for this ordered creation was Ma'at, and this is a concept so central to Egyptian civilization that it deserves to be held carefully, turned in the light, examined from every angle. Because Ma'at was not just order in the abstract sense. Ma'at was truth. Ma'at was justice. Ma'at was the rightness of things in their proper places. Ma'at was the principle that governed not only the cosmos, but the courtroom, not only the heavenly bodies, but the human heart. The Egyptians imagined Ma'at as a goddess, a woman, slim and upright, with a single ostrich feather in her headdress, the feather that would famously weigh against the hearts of the dead in the Hall of Judgment. But Ma'at was also, more broadly, the state of things when they were as they should be, the Nile flooding at the right time and receding properly, the sun rising and setting on schedule, the king ruling wisely and justly, the fields producing their harvest, the dead reaching their rest. Ma'at was the deep grain of a functioning universe. Against Ma'at stood Isfit, chaos, disorder, falsehood, violence, the dissolution of pattern. Isfit was not a goddess in quite the same way. It was more a condition, a state, the thing that happened when Ma'at was disrupted. And the entire religious and political project of ancient Egypt was, in a sense, dedicated to maintaining Ma'at against the constant pressure of Isfit. The pharaoh was the guarantor of Ma'at. The temples were machines for producing Ma'at. The priests made offerings not merely out of piety, but because they understood that the gods, like everything else, needed to be sustained, and that a sustained god was a god who could hold the universe together against the chaos pressing at its edges. This was not a metaphor to the Egyptians. They genuinely believed that the rituals performed in the temples, the offerings of food, the burning of incense, the singing of hymns, the daily ceremonies that enacted the sun's journey across the sky, were necessary for the sun to rise the next morning. The universe was not self-sustaining. It required constant tending. It was, in a very real sense, a collaborative project between gods and humans, and the temples were the workshop where that collaboration happened. Of all the forces that needed to be tended, none was more important, none was more watched and celebrated and anxiously anticipated than the journey of Ra across the sky. Ra, whom the Egyptians also called Re, and who merged over the centuries with Adam to become Ra Adam, and who merged later with the Theban god Ammonius to become Ammonius Ra, the greatest and most syncretic deity in the entire Egyptian pantheon. Ra was the sun. But again, this is a translation that flattens something profound. Ra was not merely the astronomical object, the ball of plasma 93 million miles away whose light and heat make life possible. Ra was the living principle of solar fire, the generative warmth and creative force that the sun represents. He was consciousness made radiant. He was the gaze of the divine, sweeping across the world every day, seeing everything, illuminating everything, making the world visible and therefore real. The Egyptians conceived of Ra's daily journey in extraordinarily vivid terms. He did not simply travel across a passive sky, he sailed it. Ra traveled in a great boat, the Man-Jet, the solar bark, which carried him and his divine crew from the eastern horizon at dawn to the western horizon at dusk. Every day, in the east, at the first blush of color before the sun appeared, the gods prepared the bark. Every day Ra stepped aboard and the journey began. The sky above him was the belly of Nut, and he was sailing through his grandmother's body, from her toes in the east to her fingertips in the west. Different hours of the day brought different qualities of light, and the Egyptians were exquisitely sensitive to these differences. In the morning, Ra was sometimes depicted as Khepri, the scarab-headed god of transformation and becoming, the beetle that rolls its ball of dung across the earth in an image the Egyptians found deeply resonant with the sun rolling across the dome of the sky, carrying within it the seed of new life. The scarab lays its eggs in the ball of dung it rolls, and from that apparently dead matter, new life emerges. From the darkness of the night, the sun re-emerges, new-made, carrying within it the germ of the coming day. At noon, at the height of his power, Ra was himself, the blazing, merciless, glorious disk, Aten, his full manifestation, too brilliant to look at directly, the very center of the living world. Around him in the bark stood the other gods, Thoth with his pen ready, Mot with her feather, Horus the navigator, the fierce serpent goddess Wadjet at the prow, her hood spread and her venom ready for any enemy that dared approach. In the evening, as the light softened and the day bent toward its end, Ra became Adam again, the completed one, the old one, the one who had gone through the full cycle and arrived at his destination carrying the accumulated weight of all the hours. He was painted as an old man now, walking with a staff, dignified and tired, moving toward the western horizon where the sky met the desert and the world of the living ended. But the most extraordinary part of Ra's journey, the part that required the most courage, both in him and in the priests and worshippers who accompanied him through ritual and prayer, was not the daylight crossing at all. It was what happened after the sun disappeared. The Egyptians did not believe, as some cultures did, that the sun simply went away at night and came back in the morning. They believed the sun went through something. The sun died, in a real sense, every evening and was reborn every morning. And what happened in between was a journey into the realm that was, in Egyptian theology, the most terrifying and the most transformative of all places, the Duat. The Duat was the underworld. Not hell, exactly, not a place of punishment, though it had its dangerous regions. Not purgatory, not Hades, not the Norse hell. The Duat was the land of the dead, yes, but it was also the land of the unconscious cosmos, the space through which all the deep forces of existence moved when they were not visible to the surface world. The Duat was the hidden realm. It was the back of the tapestry, where all the threads that appeared so orderly from the front ran in tangles and knots and wild curves, and from which the ordered pattern of the visible world was actually sustained. Every night, as the sun slipped below the western horizon, Ra's bark left the sky and entered the Duat. And the solar bark became the Mesectet, The night bark, and its journey through the 12 hours of darkness, was as precisely mapped as its journey through the 12 hours of day. The Egyptians wrote whole texts about this journey: the Amduat, the Book of Gates, the Book of Caverns, vast topographies of the underworld, detailed itineraries of the dangers and wonders through which Ra must pass. In the first hour of night, the bark entered a great corridor of darkness and was met by the gods and spirits who lived in that first region. Some greeted Ra with joy. The souls of the righteous dead lined the banks of the subterranean river through which the bark moved, and they cried out his names, each hour bringing new divine names, new aspects of his identity, new facets of his power that were only revealed in the dark. There is something remarkable in this, that the Egyptians believed the sun had names it could only speak in the underworld, aspects of itself that could only be revealed in darkness. The idea that things are more fully themselves in the hidden realm than in the visible one is a deeply sophisticated theological claim, and it pulses through the entire structure of Egyptian thought like a second heartbeat. As the hours deepened, the dangers increased. In the fifth hour, Ra passed through the domain of Soker, a strange, falcon-headed god of the necropolis, a deity associated with the deepest and most inert form of death, the absolute stillness at the heart of the underworld. This was the most dangerous passage, the nadir of the night, the point furthest from light and life. Here the solar bark could be stopped. Here the forces of chaos were at their strongest. And at the heart of those forces was a being the Egyptians both dreaded and spoke of constantly, whose name was not to be said casually, whose existence was the single greatest threat to the continued functioning of the universe. His name was Apophis, Apep, the great serpent, the coiled darkness that had existed since before creation and that would exist after it, if it were ever given the chance to win. Apophis was not simply a monster. Apophis was the embodiment of non-being, of Isfit at its most concentrated and powerful. Every night, as Ra moved through the deepest hours of the Duat, Apophis waited. And every night, Apophis attacked. The battle was never quick, and it was never guaranteed. The crew of the solar bark fought with every weapon they possessed. The fierce lion-headed goddess Sekhmet breathed her fiery breath. Set, and here we must pause, because Set is such a complex figure in the Egyptian imagination, both the great villain of the Osiris story and, in this context, the indispensable hero. Set stood at the prow of the bark and drove his spear into the coils of Apophis again and again. The other gods pulled the ropes that kept the bark from being swallowed into the darkness. The serpent was never killed. It could not be killed. Killing it would simply have transformed it into something else, because chaos does not die, it only changes form. But every night, through the combined effort of the gods, Apophis was held back. Bound, repelled, driven away for another cycle. And the bark moved on, through the remaining hours of darkness, toward the place where the journey would complete itself. Because the final miracle of the night journey was not a battle. It was a reunion. Deep in the Duat, in the sixth hour, the midpoint, the still center of the night, Ra met Osiris. The sun god of the living world encountered the god of the dead in the god's own realm, and they merged. Briefly, temporarily, but completely, Ra and Osiris became one. The living sun and the dead king, the above and the below, the traveling and the still, the light and the darkness, for one suspended moment at the center of the night, they were a single being. This is one of the most breathtaking ideas in Egyptian theology. The fusion of Ra and Osiris in the Duat was not merely a theological convenience. It was a statement about the nature of existence itself, that life and death are not opposites, but complementary aspects of a single divine reality. That the sun is not just the sun, it is also the principle of resurrection, the daily demonstration that death is not an ending but a transition, that the light that seems to die every evening carries within it the seed of its own rebirth, nourished by its contact with the dead. And in the 12th hour, the final hour of the night, the solar bark reached the boundary between the underworld and the world above. The gates opened. The great serpent that had wrapped around the bark opened its mouth, and from that mouth, in an image that is utterly unmistakable, utterly primal, Ra was reborn. Not simply released, not simply freed, born. emerging from the serpent's body like a child from a womb, renewed and remade and blazing with a new day's fire, shooting upward into the eastern sky as Khepri the scarab, the eternal transformer, rolling the disk of the sun above the horizon. Dawn. The world survived another night. The priests in the temples breathed again. The farmers in their fields could look east and see the sky brightening and know, for another day, that the universe had held. That the machinery of Maat had not failed. That the sun, which is also the dead king reborn, which is also the self-created God of everything, which is also the luminous principle of all consciousness, had made it through the dark. Every day, this is what sunrise meant in ancient Egypt. Not just a natural phenomenon. A triumph. A resurrection. A proof, offered fresh every morning, that existence was still winning. It was into this finely tuned cosmic order, this clockwork of sun and flood and star, this universe held in place by the constant effort of gods and humans together, that Osiris stepped as king. And here the mythology shifts register entirely. What has been, up to this point, a story about forces and principles, about the architecture of space and time, about the cosmological machinery of existence, all of this gives way, suddenly and completely, to something more intimate, more human, more heartbreaking. Because the story of Osiris is not, at its core, a cosmological myth at all. It is a family tragedy. It is a story about a brother who loved his brother, and about what jealousy does when it goes unanswered. It is a story about a husband and wife, and about the kind of love that does not end when the beloved dies. It is, depending on how you read it, either the most hopeful story ever told or the most devastating. Perhaps it is both simultaneously, which is why it has endured for 4,500 years, and why human beings on every continent have recognized something of themselves in it. Osiris was the firstborn of Geb and Nut. He inherited the earth from his father and the skies blessing from his mother, and he became the first king of Egypt, not a pharaoh in the historical sense, not a man in a tall white crown making administrative decisions about grain storage, but something more fundamental, the divine king, the You Are King, the archetype against which all subsequent kingship would be measured. Every pharaoh who ever sat on the throne of Egypt was understood to be Osiris's living representative, or rather, to be Horus, the son of Osiris, who we will come to in time. But the chain of divine kingship that ran through 30 dynasties and 3,000 years began here, with Osiris on his throne at the beginning of the world. What kind of king was he? The texts are consistent in their portrait. Osiris was good. This is stated so simply and so emphatically in the sources that it is easy to glide past it, but it is worth holding for a moment. In a mythology full of gods who are magnificent and terrifying and capricious and glorious, Osiris is specifically described as good. Not merely powerful, not merely wise, good. He taught his people agriculture. He showed them how to make bread and wine. He ended the practice of cannibalism, which the Egyptians associated with the pre-civilizational past, with the chaotic time before order was established, and replaced it with the blessed abundance of cultivated earth. He traveled, some texts say, across the whole world, teaching civilization everywhere he went, bringing the gift of ordered, nourishing life to peoples who had not known it. He ruled with Isis at his side, and this pairing is perhaps the most significant partnership in all of Egyptian theology. Osiris and Isis were not merely husband and wife, not merely the king and his queen. They were something more fundamental, the complementary principles of divine sovereignty and divine wisdom, of benevolent power and transformative love, of visible authority and hidden magic. Osiris was the king who is seen. Isis was the intelligence behind the throne that was not always visible but without which nothing worked. Isis was, in the language of the priesthood, the greatest magician in existence. Her power was not martial, not physical, it was deeper than that. She understood the nature of things. She knew the secret names of the gods, which in Egyptian theology was the key to all power, because a thing's true name is its essential nature, and to know a thing's true name is to know how it works, to understand its deepest mechanism, to be able to speak to it at the level where it is most itself. Later in the mythological tradition, she would trick Ra himself into revealing his secret name to her, would allow a serpent fashioned from Ra's own spittle to bite him, and then offer to heal him only if he whispered his true name to her. The greatest god in the universe, wounded and weakening, whispering his deepest secret into the ear of the great magician. And she took that name and used it, and her power became, in the theological calculus, greater even than Ra's. But all of that was later. In the time of Osiris's kingdom, Isis was queen, and she was beloved, and the world was as close to perfect as the world could be. The Nile flooded and receded as it should. The grain grew. The sun crossed the sky and returned safely every morning. The dead went to their rest in the Duat and were judged by the feather of Ma'at and found their place in the eternal order. The cosmic machine ran smoothly and beautifully, and at its center was Osiris on his throne and Isis beside him, and the whole of Egypt basked in what the texts call the first time, Zep-Tepi, the golden age at the beginning of things, when the gods ruled directly and the world was new and the weight of all subsequent history had not yet accumulated. But something was wrong. Something had always been wrong, even in this golden age, even in this perfection. And its name was Set. Set. Typhon. The Greeks called him, a name that became synonymous with monstrous chaos that gave its name to typhoon. But Set himself is a more complicated creature than any simple monster. He is one of the most contested figures in the Egyptian imagination, a deity whose significance and moral valence shifted dramatically across the 3,000 years of pharaonic history, who was worshipped as a great protector in one era and vilified as the embodiment of evil in another, who stood at the prow of Ra's bark defending the sun against Apophis, that ultimate act of heroism, and yet who murdered his own brother and scattered the pieces of his body across the length of Egypt. Set is the principle of disruption. Not evil in the simplistic sense, not a being who hates good and chooses darkness for its own sake. Set is something more interesting and more troubling than that. He is the energy that will not be contained, the will that will not submit, the power that finds the existing order insufficient, that chafes against hierarchy and precedence, that insists on its own right to the center even when the center is rightfully someone else's. He had been violent at his own birth, bursting through Nut's side rather than waiting for the proper time. He was associated with the desert and the storm and the red sands and the foreign peoples who pressed against Egypt's borders, all the forces that existed at the margins of the ordered world that did not submit to the civilizing principle of Osiris. He was massive, in the divine imagination a being of enormous, barely controlled power, his animal head uncertain and strange, the famous Set animal that has never been identified with any creature in the natural world, those straight-backed ears, that long curved snout, as if his very form refused to fit into any existing category. And he hated his brother. The sources are somewhat circumspect about the nature of Set's hatred, about what precisely drove him to what he did. Some speak simply of envy, that Set looked at Osiris on his throne, at the love the world bore for his brother, at the ease with which Osiris wore his authority, and felt the hot corrosive burn of jealousy spread through him. Some texts add a specific grievance, that Set's wife Nephthys, the dark twin of Isis, the quieter goddess of the threshold, had, disguised as Isis herself, lain with Osiris and conceived from him. The child of that union, they say, was Anubis, the jackal-headed god of embalming and the dead, born of the fertile king and the death goddess, the guardian of the passage between worlds. And Set, discovering this, found his jealousy curdled into something harder and colder and more deliberate. Whatever the precise shape of his motivation, Set made a plan. And the plan was not impulsive, not the violence of the desert storm, blind and directionless. The plan was precise. The plan was careful. The plan was, in its terrible way, brilliant. He had a chest built. Not an ordinary chest, a magnificent one, exactly the dimensions of his brother's body, because Set had measured Osiris in secret, had taken his measurements as carefully as a craftsman takes measurements for a commission, and had ordered from the finest artisans in the land a chest that would fit one being in all the world perfectly. The chest was painted and gilded, made with the luxury appropriate to a king, and it may have been beautiful. It must have been beautiful. The chest in which a god would die would have to be beautiful. Set invited Osiris to a banquet. A great celebration, a feast attended by 72 conspirators. The number is specific in the texts, 72, a number that carries echoes of cosmic significance, of the 72 degrees of the zodiac, of the 72 days it takes for a star to rise and set at certain latitudes. 72 conspirators who knew what was planned, who had agreed to it, who gathered around the feast table with wine and music and false smiles while the king they were plotting against ate and drank among them, trusting, beloved, at ease in the company of his brother. And Set produced the chest. He brought it into the hall with all the ceremony of a gift, the magnificent, gilded, gleaming chest, and he announced to the assembled company that the chest would be given as a gift to whomever it fit most perfectly. A game. A pleasant after-dinner amusement. Each person in turn would climb into the chest and lie within it, and they would see how it fit. One by one the guests climbed in. One by one they rose, the chest too large or too small, and returned to their places. And then Osiris, laughing perhaps, trusting certainly, lay down in the chest. It fit perfectly. 72 men fell upon the lid simultaneously. They slammed it shut. They sealed it with molten lead, that heavy metal that admits no air, that makes the seal final. And before Osiris could cry out, before he could call upon his power or his wife's magic or the protection of any god in the universe, they carried the sealed chest to the Nile and threw it in. The king of the world drowned in the dark. The first king, the good king, the teacher of civilization, the husband of Isis, the lord of the ordered cosmos, he suffocated or drowned in the sealed chest, and the Nile took him, and the river carried him away. And Set was king. The world did not end. This is worth noting, the world did not immediately shatter when Osiris died. The sun continued its course. The Nile flowed. People woke and worked and ate and slept, because the machinery of creation does not stop for grief. But something had gone wrong in the deep structure of things. Something fundamental had been broken. Ma'at had been violated not at the edges of the world, but at its very center. The king was dead, murdered by treachery, and the kingship had been stolen by the murderer. And the principle that organized the entire created universe had been dealt a wound that, if not healed, would eventually prove fatal. The gods knew it. The divine order felt it. And one goddess, above all others, understood immediately what had happened and what it meant. Isis. What Isis felt when she heard, when she knew, when her magic told her with awful certainty what had been done to her husband, is not described in the clinical language of myth recording. But it is everywhere in the tradition, this grief. It is painted on the walls of tombs. It is expressed in the formal mourning gestures of the funerary tradition, the arms raised over the head, the hair unbound and let fall, the public expression of a grief that was simultaneously private and cosmic. Isis had lost her husband. Egypt had lost its king. The universe had lost its anchor. She moved immediately. She did not waste time in paralysis, did not let grief pin her to one place. She began to search. She cut her hair, the great magical black hair, the power of a goddess concentrated in each strand, and she bound it in mourning. She tore her fine linen dress, the divine raiment, and went out in the torn clothing of a woman bereaved. She went to the Nile, to the river that had taken her husband, and she began asking. She asked the fish in the water, the birds in the reeds. She wandered through the delta, through the marshes where the papyrus grew thick and green and the ibis stood on one leg in the still water, and she asked and asked. And people answered. Children, some of the texts say, children who play in the margins of civilization, in the spaces between order and wild, told her which way the chest had gone. She followed the current in her heart even when her eyes could not find the trail. Some versions of the myth say the chest traveled far beyond Egypt, carried by the Nile to the sea, and by the sea all the way to Byblos, on the coast of what is now Lebanon. That it came to rest at the base of a great tamarisk tree, and that the tree grew around it over time, enclosing the chest and the king within it, and that the tamarisk grew so magnificent, so vast and fragrant, that the king of Byblos had it cut down to use as a pillar in his palace. That Osiris lay, sealed in his chest, sealed in his tree, upright in the court of a foreign king, while Isis searched. But the chest would be found. Isis, whose love was stronger than geography, whose magic was deeper than death, would find it. She would find it, and she would bring it back to Egypt, and what happened then would become the central event not merely of Egyptian mythology, but of the Egyptian understanding of what death means, what love can do, what the human soul is capable of in its most extraordinary moments. The chest was found. Osiris was brought home. And Set, watchful, paranoid, fierce in the way of those who know they have committed unforgivable acts, discovered what his sister had done. And he acted again. He found the chest. He opened it, and he looked at his brother's face for the second time, that face that was a reproach to him simply by existing, that beauty and that goodness that he had hated and desired and feared and finally destroyed. And whatever he felt, looking at that face, he did not hesitate. He reached into the chest, and he took his brother's body, and he tore it apart. Some accounts say 14 pieces. Some say 42, one for each nome of Egypt, one for each administrative district of the land, the murdered king's body distributed across the geography of his kingdom like a terrible map of everything he had once held together. Set scattered the pieces of Osiris across Egypt, into the Nile, into the desert, into the marshes, pieces hidden, sunk, buried, carried by the current, lost in the reeds. And Isis, who had just found him, Isis, who had perhaps allowed herself to believe for one brief, luminous moment that love had won, that she had retrieved what was taken, Isis discovered what had been done. The grief of that second loss. The doubling of it, the cruelty of it, the specific awfulness of finding and then losing again, of having hope given back only to be ripped away. This is the moment that Egyptian myth chose to end on, to leave hanging in the air. Because some griefs are too large to summarize or resolve. They have to be lived. Isis stood in the ruins of what she had briefly held, and she felt the full weight of what Set had done, and she gathered herself. Because she was the greatest magician in existence. Because she was the mother of what was to come, though she did not yet know what was to come. Because love, when it is deep enough, when it is older than the stars and fiercer than the desert sun, does not end when it is denied. It transforms. She began again. She would search every piece of Egypt, every inch of the river's edge, every drift of silt and bend of current, every reed-tangled marsh and sun-bleached desert, until she had found every fragment of what Set had destroyed. She would put him back together. She would make him whole again. Or she would die trying. The wind off the Nile moved through the papyrus along the banks, and the sound it made was almost a name. The herons stood without moving in the shallow water, watching the river flow. Somewhere upstream, somewhere downstream, in 14 scattered places across the length of a civilization, the pieces of a god lay waiting. And a woman who would not stop moved through the reeds, calling for what she had lost, as the great river moved and the stars wheeled slowly overhead and the darkness held everything in its patient, vast, unresolved embrace. She moved the way grief moves when it has no choice but to become purpose, not quickly, not with the clean efficiency of someone who knows where they are going, but with the terrible patience of someone who has decided they will not stop until they arrive. Isis walked the length of Egypt. She walked it the way the river walks it, following every curve and doubling back on itself, pressing into the margins, exploring the places where the current slows and deposits what it has been carrying. She walked with her hair still bound in mourning, her dress still torn, and she asked everyone she met, the fishermen drawing in their nets at dawn, the washerwomen kneeling at the water's edge, the children chasing ibis through the shallow margins of the flood. She asked them all if they had seen anything strange, anything that did not belong, anything that the river had brought and left behind. The papyrus marshes of the delta held many secrets. The Nile Delta is not one river but many, a braided, shifting, constantly rearranging labyrinth of channels and sandbars and reed islands where the great river loses its identity before surrendering to the sea. It is a place of extraordinary abundance and extraordinary mystery, where the line between water and land is never certain, where the ground beneath your feet may be solid or maybe a thin crust over dark water, where herons and crocodiles and schools of Nile perch move through the same green corridors. It is a place that hides things easily. A place designed, by its very nature, for concealment. Isis moved through it like a woman who has become part of the landscape, like a heron herself, patient, still when stillness was called for, then suddenly decisive, covering ground with an economy of movement that belied the vastness of the search. She had transformed herself, some texts suggest, into a bird, a great kite, that broad-winged raptor that rides the thermals above the Nile Valley with its voice crying down from the heights, that high, keen cry the Egyptians associated with mourning and with feminine grief, and with the searching intelligence that will not be satisfied with anything less than the truth. Isis as the kite, circling the length of the country, her shadow moving across fields and rooftops, her eyes missing nothing. And piece by piece, she found them. Each finding was its own small miracle, its own specific act of love and will. A fragment here in the mud of the riverbank, deposited by the receding flood and half buried in the black silt. A piece there, lodged in the roots of a sycamore tree at the water's edge, as if the tree had caught it and kept it safe. Some pieces the fish had found first, and the texts say that Isis gave particular attention and particular honors to certain species of Nile fish ever afterward, or, in some accounts, cursed them, depending on whether they had been helpful or had damaged what they found. The Oxyrhynchus fish, the elephant-nosed fish with its strange, curling jaw, was said to have swallowed one piece entirely, the most intimate piece, the phallus of the god-king, and that piece could not be recovered. The texts are honest about this. Some things, once lost in the river, cannot be fully reclaimed. Isis did not despair. She was beyond despair, operating at a level of focus divine where ordinary emotional states no longer quite applied. She had a purpose, and the purpose organized everything. She gathered each fragment, carried each one with the absolute tenderness of someone handling something irreplaceable, which each piece was, because the pieces of Osiris were not merely the remains of a body. They were the constituent elements of divinity, the physical matrix of a god, the sacred substance through which all kingship and all fertility and all ordered existence in Egypt was expressed. To restore Osiris was not merely a personal act of love. It was a cosmological necessity. When she had found what she could find, all but the one piece the river had taken permanently, she began the work that no one had ever done before, because no one had ever needed to do it. She was inventing resurrection. She was creating, in this act of grief-driven creativity, the entire framework through which the Egyptian people would understand death and what lies beyond it for the next 3,000 years. She called for help. And the help that came was, appropriately, the help of two gods who stood at the intersection of life and death, who understood the boundary between them better than any other beings in the cosmos. Anubis came first. He is the god of embalming, the lord of the necropolis, the guardian of the threshold, and his form tells you everything you need to know about his nature before he speaks a single word. He has the head of a jackal, that lean, sharp-eared, golden-eyed animal that haunted the edges of ancient Egyptian settlements, that was found prowling around the cemeteries and burial sites, that stood at the boundary between the human world and the desert, between the living community and the city of the dead. The jackal was already associated with death simply by its habits, its residency in the marginal zones, its presence wherever human remains were laid. Anubis took that association and transformed it. The dog of the dead became the guide of the dead, the embalmer, the one who makes the passage possible. Some versions of the story say that Anubis was himself the son of Osiris and Nephthys, conceived in that moment of confusion and transgression when Nephthys, wearing the face of Isis, had lain with the king who thought she was his wife. Nephthys, fearing Set's anger, had abandoned the child, had left him in the marshes, and Isis, boundless in her capacity for love, even for the child of her husband's misdirected desire, had found him and raised him. Anubis, then, was in this telling the foster son of the woman whose husband he would now help restore to life. The relationships of the Egyptian divine family have a density and a recursive quality that is less confusing when you understand that each god is not merely a character but a principle, and principles intersect in more ways than any simple family tree can capture. Anubis brought his tools, his knowledge, his particular genius. And what he did with the pieces that Isis had gathered was to create the first mummy. He bound them together with linen wrappings, sacred and clean. He anointed the body with oils and resins. He performed the rituals that he was in the process of inventing, rituals that would be performed over the bodies of pharaohs and priests and farmers and artisans for the next 3,000 years, each time citing Osiris as the precedent. Each time understanding that what was being done to a human body at death was what Anubis had first done for the god who made resurrection possible. Thoth was there too. Thoth, who had given the world the extra days that allowed the gods to be born, who was the keeper of sacred knowledge, the divine scribe, the god who had more in common with the idea of intelligence itself than with any particular subject or domain. Thoth knew the words of power. Thoth knew the spells that could call the divine breath back, that could persuade the soul to return to the body that had been prepared to receive it. He was the medical text and the religious text and the magical text all at once, and he recited over the wrapped and reassembled body of Osiris the formulae that no one had ever spoken over anyone before, because no one had ever needed them before. And then Isis, in her form as the great kite, spread her wings. There is an image in Egyptian funerary art that appears again and again, in tomb paintings and on sarcophagi and in illustrated papyri, and it is one of the most striking images in the entire visual vocabulary of the ancient world. It shows Osiris lying prone, wrapped in the white linen of the mummy, still and dark. And above him, descending, her great wings spread to their full enormous span, is the figure of Isis. The wings create the wind, and the wind carries the divine breath, the Ka, the life force, back into the inert body. Isis fans life back into the dead. What happened in that moment is described in terms that the Egyptians did not treat as metaphor. Osiris stirred. Not fully, he did not rise and walk and speak. The resurrection of Osiris was not a return to ordinary life, because the world had changed in the moment of his murder, and that change could not be undone. Some thresholds, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed. Osiris was reborn, but into a different mode of existence. He was alive, and he was dead, simultaneously. He was the first of the resurrected dead, the proof that death was not an ending but a transformation, and the state he existed in was not the state he had occupied as the living king of the living world. But he was present enough. He was present enough for Isis. She conceived Horus. The texts speak of this with their characteristic directness. The great magical act of Isis, one of the greatest acts of magic in the entire Egyptian tradition, was to take seed from the dead king and from it conceive the heir who would avenge his father and restore the rightful order of the universe. She became Horus's mother in an act that was simultaneously utterly natural and utterly extraordinary, the most primal biological fact given cosmic significance. The continuation of the bloodline that was also the continuation of divine sovereignty, of the principle of righteous kingship in the world. Having accomplished this, having gathered the pieces, having called the magicians, having restored enough of Osiris to conceive their child, Isis left her husband in the care of those who understood the underworld. She left him to his new kingdom. Because if Osiris could not fully return to the world of the living, he could reign supreme over the world of the dead. And the world of the dead needed a king just as desperately as the world of the living did. Osiris descended into the Duat and took his throne, and the geography of the underworld reorganized itself around him as naturally as water reorganizes around a new stone placed in a river's course. He became the Lord and Judge of the dead, the King of eternity, the one before whom every soul that had ever lived would eventually stand to account for itself. He was depicted in his divine form now, green-skinned, the color of vegetation and of the river's silt, the color of life returning, wrapped still in the white linen of the mummy from the waist down, immobile as a statue and yet fully present, fully conscious, fully royal. He wore the Atef crown, that tall white crown flanked by ostrich feathers, the feathers of Maat herself, because his domain was judgment and truth. He held in his hands the crook and the flail, the symbols of kingship and of the shepherd who both guides and chastises his flock. He sat at the end of the Hall of Two Truths, in the deepest and most sacred chamber of the underworld, and the dead came before him, and he weighed their hearts. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before we follow the dead into that chamber, we must first follow the living. Specifically, we must follow the child who was growing in the womb of the greatest magician in the world, hidden in the papyrus marshes of the Delta, waiting to be born into a world that was already shaped by the tragedy he had not yet witnessed and the vengeance he had not yet enacted. The Delta marshes were Horus's first home, and Isis chose them deliberately. Set was king now, Set, who had committed the unforgivable and gotten away with it, at least for the moment. Set, who would not hesitate to destroy the unborn child of his murdered brother if he knew of its existence. So Isis hid. She, who was a queen and a goddess of supreme power, chose the marsh reeds and the mud islands and the anonymous life of a woman in hiding because her child mattered more than her dignity, more than her comfort, more than anything. She gave birth to Horus in the marshes, and the child who arrived was fierce even in infancy, fierce in the way of the falcon, which is what he was, the falcon god, Horus the younger, Horus in some traditions. Harpocrates to the Greeks who would later inherit his worship and transform him into the god of childhood with his finger to his lips in an eternal gesture of silence and mystery. His eyes were the sun and the moon, one golden and one silver, the two lights of the sky contained in the gaze of a child lying in the reeds while his mother kept watch above him. Isis could not always be there. She had to move, had to seek food and allies and the information she needed to protect her son, and when she left Horus alone in the marsh, protected by the magic she wove around him as carefully as she had woven the linen around his father's body. But magic is not perfect. The world is not perfectly safe. And the dangers of the Delta found him even in his hiding place. The texts speak of scorpion stings and snake bites, of the child going limp in the reed nest, of Isis returning to find him cold and still, and her cries going up to the very sky until Are stopped his solar bark in its course, stopped the entire machinery of the daytime cosmos, to send Thoth down to earth to heal the child with divine words of power. These episodes of danger and healing in Horus's childhood were not merely dramatic episodes. They were, for the Egyptians, a whole category of religious practice. The magical healing texts that invoked this story, that called upon the precedent of Thoth healing the child Horus, were used for centuries in actual medical practice, recited by physicians over sick children, carving the narrative of divine recovery into the living situation of a human patient and thereby lending it the force of cosmic precedent. Horus survived. He grew in the marsh. He was raised on stories his mother told him, in her voice that was both a queen's voice and a fugitive's voice, about his father, about what had been done, about what the world owed him and what he owed the world. Isis gave Horus his inheritance in words, long before he was old enough to claim it in any other way. She shaped him with the story of Osiris the way a potter shapes clay, pressing the narrative into him, forming his identity around the absent father, around the obligation of the son, around the understanding that what Set had done was not merely a crime against a family, but a wound in the fabric of the universe that only the rightful king could heal. She gave him something else, too. She gave him her own fierce intelligence, her own strategic patience, her own understanding that power is not only won by force, but by cunning and timing and the ability to see several moves ahead. Horus would need all of these gifts when the time came to face his uncle. Because Set was formidable. Set was the chaos principle at the heart of the divine family, and he was not going to yield the throne simply because a child arrived to claim it. When Horus came of age and emerged from the marshes, he came into a conflict that would prove to be one of the longest, most complex, most legally intricate disputes in all of mythology. The contest between Horus and Set for the throne of Egypt is not primarily a battle story, though it has its share of violence. It is, at its heart, a legal drama, a theological argument about the nature of legitimate authority, about what makes a king, about whether power is its own justification or whether it must derive from something older and more principled than mere force. The gods of the Egyptian pantheon gathered to adjudicate. The divine tribunal convened, and at its head sat Adam, the creator himself, whose authority was supreme and whose word should have been sufficient to settle the matter. Set's claim was not without logic. He was older than Horus by a generation. He was physically the most powerful god in existence, and he was, in the brutal arithmetic of accomplished fact, already king. The throne was his. He was occupying it. Did the fact of his occupation not confer its own legitimacy? Horus's claim was different in nature. He was the son of Osiris, the legitimate heir by blood, the child who had been conceived for exactly this purpose, the one whose very existence was an act of legal continuity stretching from the murdered king to the future. He was young and Osiris was dead and Set was powerful, but the law was on his side, not merely human law, but the deepest law of the cosmos, the law of Ma'at, which held that the son inherits from the father, that the rightful line of succession cannot be broken by murder without the universe itself being permanently diminished. Who was old and powerful and perhaps more comfortable with Set's kind of strength than with the complexity of legitimate claims, initially favored Set. There are accounts that describe the assembled gods groaning at Ra's stubbornness. That described the goddess Neith sending a stern message to the divine tribunal pointing out that to give the throne to the murderer over the son was an absurdity that would embarrass the gods in the eyes of all creation. There are passages where Osiris himself, from the depths of the Duat, sent up protests so fierce that the gods in the divine council fell silent with something very like guilt. The contest moved through phases. There were physical battles between Horus and Set, and these were extraordinary in their violence and their strangeness. Set tore out the eye of Horus, that great falcon eye, the lunar eye, the silver one, in one of their conflicts. Horus, in retaliation, did something to Set that the texts describe with the same frank explicitness they apply to the rest of the story, something that involved the seed of Set being introduced into Horus's body and then expelled, and then introduced into Set in a sequence of transgression and reversal that Thoth managed and recorded with his habitual precision, and which was understood by the Egyptians as a contest not merely of physical power but of honor and status, of who is the active principle and who the passive, of what the act of domination truly accomplished and who it truly diminished. Thoth, in the midst of this, recovered the eye of Horus. He found it, or in some accounts healed it, making it whole again, restoring the lunar light that Set had extinguished. The restored eye of Horus became one of the most powerful symbols in Egyptian religious life. The Wedjat, the whole eye, the eye that had been wounded and made well, became an amulet of healing and protection worn by the living and placed with the dead. Every eye-shaped piece of faience that archaeologists have found in the burials of ancient Egyptians, those thousands and thousands of blue-green eye amulets, each one carries the echo of the story, of the moment when Thoth the healer gave back what violence had taken. The contest continued through challenges and tests and divine deliberations that stretched across what the texts call 80 years, not literal decades, but an indication of the depth and difficulty of the question being resolved, of how genuinely hard the gods found it to decide what legitimate authority looked like when it was contested by raw power. There were boat races because the Egyptians never lost their love of the Nile and its traffic. There were transformations into animals, the gods shifting shapes in their combat the way storms shift shape. There were appeals and counter-appeals, arguments made and made again, positions staked and retreated from. And through it all, Horus held his claim. He held it with the patience his mother had given him and the intelligence she had pressed into him in the marshes, and he held it too with a kind of moral gravity that Set, for all his power, for all his genuine cosmic importance as the one who fought Apophis, as the necessary principle of violent disruption without which the universe would become too ordered and static to live in, could never match. Set had strength. Horus had right. And in the Egyptian cosmological imagination, right, however long it took, was supposed to win. The final judgment came. The tribunal assembled for the last time. the gods arrayed in their divine council with the evidence of 80 years of contest before them. Osiris sent one final communication from the depths of the Duat, a message at once tender and threatening, pointing out that the grain that feeds the gods and the cattle that sustains them and the vegetables that appear on the divine offering tables all come from the earth, which is his domain, and that the dead who fill the underworld are very numerous and very restless, and that perhaps the divine council should consider very carefully whether it wished to rule over a world that still functioned or a world that had been abandoned by the principle of righteous justice. The gods deliberated. The gods decided. Horus was given the throne. Set was not destroyed, he was not killed, he was not banished to some permanent exile, because the Egyptians were too sophisticated in their theology for that kind of simplistic resolution. Set was repositioned. He was taken to the solar bark, given his place at the prow, assigned his eternal role as the defender of Ra against Apophis, the fighter in the cosmic darkness who used his immense and frightening power for the greatest possible purpose. Set would never be rehabilitated entirely. He would remain, in the mainstream tradition, the one who had murdered Osiris, the one who had tried to steal what was not his. But he would also remain necessary, because a universe without his particular kind of disruptive energy would be a universe that had tipped too far into stasis, and stasis is just another name for death. Horus took the throne. The rightful king sat in his father's place, and the wound in the order of the universe, while it could not be entirely healed, the original crime was still there, still in the past, still the fact around which everything else was organized, was answered, was addressed. Justice had been served, after 80 years, through the persistence of a son who had been shaped by the stories his mother told him in the reeds. And in that moment, a pattern was established that would define Egyptian civilization for 3 millennia. The pattern of the divine king. Every pharaoh who sat on the throne of Egypt understood himself, was understood by his priests, his people, and the theology that organized everything around him, as Horus. Not metaphorically Horus. Not symbolically Horus. Horus. The living falcon god, the rightful heir, the one who had prevailed in the contest between order and chaos and had been given the earth as his rightful inheritance. The pharaoh was the hinge point between the human world and the divine one, the place where the two orders met and exchanged their energies. He was the son of Ra, which connected him to the solar principle, to the generative creative fire at the heart of the cosmos. He was simultaneously Horus, which connected him to the lineage of Osiris, to the principle of righteous succession, to the legal and moral dimension of kingship. And when the pharaoh died, he became Osiris. This transformation from Horus in life to Osiris in death was not merely a pleasant theological nicety. It was the organizing principle of the entire funerary tradition, of the elaborate system of burial and ritual and prayer that makes Egypt so recognizable across the millennia. The pharaoh in death was Osiris, and the mummification and burial rites performed for him were the rites that Anubis and Isis and Thoth had first performed for the murdered god-king in the beginning. Every royal funeral was a reenactment of the first funeral. Every royal burial chamber was, in its essential nature, the Duat prepared to receive the divine dead. And every new pharaoh, by ascending the throne, was Horus triumphant, the son who had won the contest, the rightful heir vindicating his father's memory. The continuity of kingship from one pharaoh to the next was the continuity of the cosmic drama, played out in political and ceremonial form across the generations. The son buries the father with the rites of Anubis. The son takes the throne as Horus. The father, properly buried and equipped, descends to the Duat as Osiris and takes his place in the Great Hall of Judgment. This was not merely a ritual fiction. The Egyptians believed it completely. The pharaoh genuinely was divine, was genuinely the living embodiment of the falcon god, and the welfare of the kingdom, the flooding of the Nile, the health of the harvest, the safety of the borders, the functioning of the cosmic machinery, depended on his proper performance of his divine role. A good king was not merely a capable administrator. A good king was a cosmic stabilizer, a being who by his righteous conduct and his proper performance of the sacred rituals maintained the ma'at of the universe. A bad king was, in this framework, genuinely dangerous to the structure of existence. Not merely politically unfortunate, cosmologically hazardous. Because if the hinge point between the human and the divine was corrupted or dysfunctional, the energies that flowed through it, the divine sustenance that kept the world going, would be disrupted. And the consequences would be felt not merely in the palace, but in the floods and the harvests and the stars. This is why the pharaoh was the most ritual-intensive figure in the ancient world. Every moment of his day was hedged around with religious significance. He woke and was ritually purified and dressed and fed in ceremonies that were simultaneously practical and cosmic. He performed the daily temple rituals, or had his priests perform them as his proxies, that sustained the gods in their divine functions. He wore specific crowns for specific occasions, each crown carrying its own theological weight, its own connection to specific divine principles. He carried the crook and the flail of Osiris. He wore the Uraeus serpent at his brow, the fierce solar eye of Ra turned outward to protect him and through him the kingdom. He was, in his physical person, a walking theological statement about the nature of legitimate power and its relationship to the divine order. The ordinary people of Egypt, the farmers and craftsmen and merchants and scribes who made up the vast majority of the population, participated in this theological system not merely as passive subjects, but as active contributors. Their labor in the fields was an act of cosmic maintenance. Their offerings at the local shrines sustained the divine economy. Their proper conduct in their lives, their honesty in their dealings, their care for their families, their respect for the divine order, was a daily vote for Ma'at against Isfet. The cosmic drama was not something that happened only in temples or palaces or the deep chambers of the underworld. It was happening everywhere, all the time, in the most ordinary acts of an ordinary life. The temples themselves were extraordinary machines for the maintenance of Ma'at, and to understand them is to understand something fundamental about how the Egyptians thought about the relationship between the visible and the invisible, between the physical and the divine. An Egyptian temple was not a meeting place. The great temples of Karnak and Luxor and Abydos and Edfu and Philae were not places where the congregation gathered to worship together, as a church or a mosque or a synagogue would be understood in the traditions they gave rise to. The temples were houses of the gods, literal residences, palatial residences, buildings designed and maintained to be comfortable and suitable for a divine inhabitant. The god lived in the innermost sanctuary, in the naos, the Holy of Holies, in the form of a statue made of the most precious materials available, gold, lapis lazuli, obsidian, carnelian. And the statue was not a representation of the god. The statue was the god. The divine essence, the ka of the deity, inhabited the statue the way a human soul inhabits a body, and the daily rituals performed by the priests were literally the acts of servants caring for a living being of supreme importance. Every morning, the priests who had been ritually purified bathed in the sacred lake, shaved of body hair, dressed in clean white linen, their mouths purified with natron, entered the innermost sanctuary. They approached the naos, the sealed golden shrine, and they broke the clay seal on the doors and opened them, and they greeted the god as a servant greets a master who has just woken. They lit incense, because the god's nostrils required something worthy to breathe. They brought food, because the god's body required sustenance, though the sustenance the gods consumed was the divine essence of the offering, the ka of the food, the spiritual nutrition that the physical substance carried, which the priests and workers would eat themselves afterward, since the material food remained perfectly intact. They changed the god's clothing, the small linen garments that dressed the statue, washing and replacing them with fresh linens, because cleanliness and care were forms of reverence. These were not symbolic acts. The Egyptians were not performing rituals that they privately understood as metaphors while publicly maintaining the fiction of divine reality. They genuinely believed that the god in the naos would be hungry if not fed, cold if not clothed, polluted if not kept clean, and that a hungry, cold, polluted god would be a god less able to do what gods were needed to do, to hold the cosmic order in place, to protect the kingdom, to ensure the rising of the sun and the flooding of the Nile and the fertility of the land. The temple rituals were maintenance work on the machinery of the universe, and the priests who performed them were cosmic engineers as much as they were religious professionals. The great temples were also economic engines, vast landholding institutions that owned herds of cattle and acres of farmland and fishing rights and quarries and workshops that employed thousands of people and stored enormous quantities of grain and oil and linen and precious goods. The wealth of the temples was not incidental to their religious function, but essential to it. The divine economy required the physical economy to support it. The gods could not be maintained without resources, and the resources were accumulated through the managed exploitation of the land that the god had, in a sense, been given by the king in a reciprocal exchange. The pharaoh gave the temple its endowments, and the god in the temple maintained the pharaoh's divine mandate and the kingdom's prosperity. The priests who served in these institutions were not a separate caste in the way that, say, the Brahmin class of India was a separate caste from birth. Many Egyptian priests served part-time, rotating in and out of temple service on a monthly basis, returning to ordinary occupations between their periods of ritual duty. The high priests of the great temples were powerful political figures as well as religious ones. The high priest of Ammonius at Karnak accumulated, by the later periods of Egyptian history, enough power to rival the pharaoh himself. But the ordinary priests who carried the divine bark in procession, who performed the morning and evening rituals, who chanted the hymns and burned the incense and killed the sacrificial animals, these were often ordinary men of middling status for whom temple service was one strand among several in the texture of a normal life. The great festivals brought the divine world into contact with the human one in a more public way. On festival days, the statue of the god would be removed from its naos and placed in the carrying shrine, the portable bark shrine, and borne on the shoulders of the priests out of the innermost sanctuary, through the hypostyle hall with its forest of inscribed columns, out through the monumental gateway of the pylon, and into the world. Crowds would gather along the processional route, pressing forward to see the closed golden shrine as it passed, unable to see the statue within but knowing it was there, close, present among them in a way it never was on ordinary days. People brought their disputes to the god on these processions, presenting their legal questions to the divine shrine, which would answer by the direction in which it pulled, by whether it moved forward or backward in the hands of the priests who carried it, by the language of the divine body expressing a divine opinion. The gods were not distant. The gods were not abstract. The gods were immediate and present and thoroughly enmeshed in the daily life of Egypt in a way that it is difficult for the modern secular imagination to fully grasp, because we have learned to think of religion as one compartment of life among others, something practiced in designated times and places and set aside in the hours between. For the Egyptians, there was no between. There was no time when the divine was not present, no activity that did not have its divine dimension, no aspect of life that was not in some sense also an aspect of theology. Among all the gods who populated this world, a few stand out not merely for their power or their roles in the great mythological dramas, but for the particular quality of their presence. The way they express something essential about the Egyptian vision of reality that no abstract theological statement quite captures. Hathor is one such deity, perhaps the most beloved goddess in the entire Egyptian pantheon, whose worship spread across Egypt and beyond with the ease and warmth of the thing she represented. She is the goddess of love, which sounds simple enough until you begin to understand what the Egyptians meant by that word. Love for them was not merely the romantic or erotic, though it was that too. Hathor was the patron of music and dance and beauty and intoxication. The goddess invoked at festivals where wine flowed and musicians played and people danced in ways that transgressed the usual boundaries of daily comportment. She was the goddess who was called the Eye of Ra, the solar fire in its benevolent form, the warmth and generativeness of the sun understood as love rather than as power. She was depicted as a woman with the horns of a cow and the disk of the sun between them, or sometimes as a cow herself, that great and sacred animal that the Egyptians associated with maternal abundance, with the nourishing wealth of the floodplain, with the patient fertility of a creature who gives milk and sustenance without demanding violence in return. Her temples, and her great temple at Dendera is one of the most complete surviving cult temples in Egypt, its painted ceilings, still bearing color after 2,000 years, were places of music and celebration as well as solemnity. The sistrums rattled in her honor, those unusual percussion instruments whose sound was said to ward off evil and to please the divine ear, whose shape echoed the body of the goddess herself. But Hathor had another aspect, one that tells you something important about how the Egyptians refused to simplify the divine. The story of Sekhmet is also, in many traditions, the story of Hathor, and the two goddesses are in some theological frameworks understood as the two faces of the same divine principle: love and destruction, tenderness and annihilation. The warm sun that makes things grow and the burning sun that kills. Sekhmet is the lioness-headed goddess, and she is terrifying in a way that even the battle gods do not quite manage. She is the wrath of Ra made incarnate, not the distant thunder of divine displeasure, but the immediate, animal, visceral fury of a power that has decided it will no longer be patient. The story most often told about her is one of the most disturbing in Egyptian mythology, and also, in its resolution, one of the most unexpectedly human. Ra, grown old, and even the sun god grows old in this tradition, becomes the aged, somewhat querulous figure who needs to be tricked by Isis and whose authority is increasingly challenged. Ra learned that humanity had grown arrogant, that the people he had wept into existence had forgotten their origins, had stopped honoring the divine order, had begun to mock the aging god behind his back. Ra was furious, and in his fury he sent Sekhmet. Sekhmet fell upon humanity like a burning wind. She slaughtered with a thoroughness and a joy that should have been impossible to enjoy, but which she, the principle of divine rage-given feline body, found entirely natural. She killed and she kept killing, and the blood she wasted herself in soaked into the earth, and still she killed, and Ra, watching her, saw something that, even in his fury, he had not anticipated. She would not stop. The punishment had become the thing itself. Sekhmet was not punishing humanity. She was erasing it. Ra repented of his wrath. Ra, the creator, the god who had wept the first humans into existence, looked at what he had unleashed and felt something that the texts identify with unmistakable clarity as remorse. He did not want humanity destroyed. He had been angry, and anger had answered him as anger will always answer, by going further than the original feeling intended. He had to trick her. The gods devised a plan. They flooded the fields of Egypt with beer that had been dyed red with ochre so that it looked like blood. Sekhmet came upon this apparent sea of slaughter and was satisfied. She drank, and the beer did what beer does to those who drink it in quantities that exceed wisdom, and Sekhmet became drunk. The rage softened. The killing instinct blurred. She slept, and when she woke, she was Hathor, gentle, loving, the golden warmth restored. The festival that commemorated this event was one of the most enthusiastically observed in the Egyptian calendar, a festival of intoxication, of drinking red beer, of celebrating the moment when the destructive capacity of the divine was turned aside by something as humble and human as a beverage. That the gods could be outmaneuvered by ingenuity, that even the most terrible divine forces had their weaknesses, that the appropriate response to uncontrollable wrath might be not confrontation, but cunning misdirection. These were characteristically Egyptian insights, and they were celebrated with a thoroughness that suggests the Egyptians found them genuinely reassuring. Then there is Baadet, the cat goddess, and here the transition from the fierce Sekhmet to the domestic Baadet is itself instructive, another pair of aspects, feline and fierce versus feline and gentle. Bastet's great cult center was at Bubastis in the Delta, and the festivals held there attracted pilgrims from across Egypt and eventually from across the Mediterranean world. Festivals of such enthusiastic celebration that the Greek historian Herodotus, visiting Egypt in the 5th century before the Common Era, described them with barely concealed wonder, vast numbers of people arriving by barge, the women clapping and singing and shaking their rattles, the crowds in the city swelling too. Numbers he claimed were larger than any other festival gathering in Egypt. The cat in Egypt was sacred not merely because of Baadet, but because of a genuine theological logic. The cat was the hunter of snakes, and snakes, particularly the cobra and the horned viper. The two most dangerous reptiles of the Egyptian environment were associated with the forces of chaos and with Apophis himself, the great serpent of the underworld. The domestic cat, sitting at the threshold of the house and hunting the serpents that threatened it, was performing, in its small and entirely natural way, the same cosmic function that Ra's crew performed nightly in the duet. Every cat was a minor sun god, holding chaos at bay at the domestic scale. No wonder they were cherished. No wonder the killing of a cat, even accidentally, carried severe penalties. No wonder the mummified bodies of cats were offered in their thousands at the shrines of Baadat, a tribute from a civilization that understood, at every level of its life, that the battle between order and chaos was never fully won and never safely over. And through all of this, through the festivals and the rituals and the battles and the judgments and the divine dramas playing out in the sky and the underworld, Thoth continued his work. Thoth, the ibis-headed, the baboon-faced, the scribe of the gods, the keeper of the divine archive, the one who recorded everything. He was said to have invented writing, which in the Egyptian context was not merely a useful administrative technology, but a divine art, a form of creation. To write a thing was to make it more real, to fix it in existence, to give it the permanence that speech, which evaporates in the air, could not provide. The hieroglyphs themselves, those extraordinary painted and incised signs, the falcon and the eye and the feather and the water and the owl and the basket, were not merely representations of sounds. Each sign carried its own divine weight, its own connection to the thing it depicted, so that the word for life written in hieroglyphs was also an actual hook of life. And the word for protection was also the actual act of spreading protective wings around the thing you wanted to guard. Thoth was the god of the moon as well as of writing, and the connection was not arbitrary. The moon measures time in a way the sun does not. The sun simply rises and sets, repeating the same arc day after day, but the moon changes, waxes and wanes, gives you a visible measure of the days passing, a counter in the sky. Time, recording, measurement, the preservation of the past, all of these were Thoth's domain, and they were all, at bottom, the same thing: the refusal to let things vanish without trace, the insistence that what has happened should be known, should be written down, should be preserved against the corrosive action of forgetting. It was Thoth who wrote down the decisions of the divine council in the Horus and set dispute. It was Thoth who recorded the outcome of every weighing of the heart in the Hall of Two Truths. It was Thoth who, in some accounts, had been given by Ra the instruction to record the name of every person at the moment of their birth, noting it in the divine register, so that when that person arrived before Osiris at the end of their life, their name was already known, their history already on file. Nothing was lost. Nothing was forgotten. Thoth made sure of it. And now we must go where every Egyptian expected, eventually, inevitably, to go. We must go into the Duat. The Duat, we have already encountered it as the territory through which Ra travels in the night hours, the underworld through which the solar bark fights its way toward dawn. But the Duat was not only the sun's nighttime path. It was the realm of the dead, the country to which every human soul journeyed at the moment of death. It was simultaneously a geography, a place with specific regions and dangers and inhabitants, and a state of being, a condition of the soul navigating its own transformation. The Egyptians were, in their approach to death, the most thoroughly prepared civilization in human history. No people before or since has invested so much intellectual and material and spiritual energy in the question of what happens when we die and how to navigate it well. The pyramids are the most obvious expression of this investment, those mountains of worked stone, each one the result of decades of organized labor, built primarily as tombs, as the physical containers in which the divine king would begin his transformation into Osiris and journey through the underworld to his eternal life. But the pyramids are only the most visible tip of an iceberg that extends through every level of Egyptian society and every century of Egyptian civilization. Even the poorest Egyptian expected some form of afterlife. Even the most humble burial, a body placed in the sand at the desert's edge, perhaps with nothing more than a clay pot and a few beads, was oriented toward the afterlife, was understood as the beginning of a journey rather than the end of one. The wealthy had their elaborate tombs cut into the cliffs of Thebes, their walls painted with scenes of the life they had lived and the life they hoped to continue in the beyond. Their bodies elaborately preserved through the process that Anubis had first performed for Osiris. The pharaohs had their great stone monuments, their Book of the Dead papyri, their shabdas, the little figurine servants who would do the agricultural labor required of them in the fields of the blessed if their name was called. But before any of this preparation could be useful, the soul had to actually make the journey. And the journey was not guaranteed. Death, for the ancient Egyptian, began with a crisis. The soul, the Egyptians understood the person to consist of multiple spiritual components, each with its own nature and its own needs, had to navigate a transition that was both literal and existential. The Ba, the personality soul, the aspect of the person that was most recognizably them, was depicted as a bird with a human head. The image appears in countless tomb paintings, the small human-headed bird hovering over the mummified body. Able to leave the tomb and fly in the world above, to revisit the places and people it had known, but also needing to return to the body for sustenance. The Ka, the vital force, the double that had been given by the Creator God at the moment of birth and that sustained the body through life, needed to be nourished by the offerings left at the tomb. The food and drink and all the good things that the funerary cult provided, which the Ka consumed in its spiritual dimension. The Ak, the luminous, transfigured spirit, the aspect of the soul that had successfully navigated the afterlife and achieved eternal life, was what the Egyptians hoped to become, the goal of the whole enormous enterprise. The journey of the dead began at the tomb, but the real territory was the Duat, and the Duat was mapped with the same precision that Egyptian surveyors applied to the land of Egypt itself. The Book of the Dead, which the Egyptians themselves called the Book of. The dead knew the names of all the gatekeepers, could speak them confidently and correctly, and the gates opened. The dead person who did not know them, who approached the underworld unprepared and ignorant, would be turned back or destroyed. There were also the so-called negative confessions, declarations made by the dead person before the tribunal in the Hall of Two Truths, a list of 42 sins that the speaker denied having committed. The list is comprehensive and revealing. I have not stolen. I have not committed violence. I have not caused anyone to weep. I have not made false accusations. I have not taken milk from the mouths of children. I have not committed adultery. I have not transgressed the boundaries of the field. I have not polluted the waters. Reading these declarations is like reading a complete moral code, because in naming the things one must not have done, you construct a picture of the ethical life the Egyptians considered right and good. The negative confessions are, in this sense, not merely a ritual performance, but a social document, a statement of the values that Egyptian civilization held most dear. But the 42 declarations were only the opening act of the judgment in the Hall of Two Truths. The culminating act, the act to which all of the elaborate preparation, all of the mummification and burial equipment and papyrus spells and amulets and offerings led, was the weighing of the heart. In the center of the hall stood the great scales. They were presided over by Anubis, who had moved from his role as embalmer to his role as psychopomp, the guide of souls, the one who escorted the newly dead to the place of their judgment and who monitored the procedure with his characteristic precision. On one pan of the scales sat the heart of the dead person, the heart which was left in the body during mummification precisely because it was needed for this moment, the only organ not removed and placed in a canopic jar, because the heart was the seat of consciousness, of intelligence, of moral character. It was the record of the life just lived. On the other pan of the scales sat a single feather, the feather of Maat. The weighing began. Thoth stood ready with his palette and his reed pen, prepared to record the outcome. The 42 judges of the dead, each associated with one of the 42 nomes of Egypt, each the divine arbiter of one specific kind of transgression, looked on. Osiris watched from his throne at the end of the hall. Isis and Nephthys flanked him. Horus stood nearby, ready to present the successful candidate to his father. The entire divine hierarchy of the underworld was assembled, because what happened here mattered not only to the individual whose heart was on the scale, but to the order of the universe, which required that the living and the dead be correctly accounted for. A heart lightened by a life well lived, by the consistent practice of Ma'at, by honesty and generosity, and the restraint of violence and the care of others, would balance against the feather. Would match it exactly, gram for spiritual gram, the lightness of right conduct equal to the lightness of the divine principle itself. This was the outcome devoutly sought, the result that every Egyptian spent their life trying to earn, the balanced scale, the equal heart, the vindication of a life. But a heart heavy with sin, burdened with the accumulated weight of lying and cheating and cruelty and all the violations of Ma'at that a human life could accumulate, a heavy heart would drag its pan down, and the scale would tip. And the imbalance would be visible to every being in the hall, a public demonstration of a private failure that could no longer be concealed. And then Ammit came. Ammit is one of the most remarkable figures in the entire Egyptian afterlife tradition, and she deserves to be held in the full strangeness of what she was. She was a composite creature, and Egyptian mythology loved composite creatures, beings assembled from the most significant parts of multiple animals, like visual equations in which the meaning of each component combined to produce the total significance of the whole. Ammit had the head of a crocodile, the forequarters of a lion or leopard, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus. She was assembled from the three most dangerous animals known to ancient Egyptians, the three creatures most associated with violent death and unpredictable lethal force. She crouched beside the scales, always. She waited. When a heart proved too heavy, Ammit ate it. And this is the crucial thing, the thing that makes Ammit not merely a monster of punishment, but a figure of genuine theological sophistication. This eating was not merely punishment. It was annihilation. The Egyptian afterlife did not feature a hell in the sense that later traditions would develop the concept, a place of eternal conscious torment where sinners suffered forever. What Ammit offered was something worse in one sense and in another sense more honest, non-existence. The heart consumed by Ammit was gone. The person whose heart had been eaten ceased to be in any sense that the Egyptians recognized as meaningful. They did not go somewhere awful. They went nowhere. They became nothing. The second death, the Egyptians called it MWT, and it was the true death, the death that was actually final, the death from which there was no returning and no continuing because there was no longer any self left to return or continue. This theological position has a remarkable logical consistency. The Egyptians did not believe that consciousness was inherently immortal, that every soul automatically survived death in some form. They believed that survival had to be earned, had to be maintained, had to be supported by proper burial and ongoing offerings and the accumulation of good deeds in life. Eternal life was not a given. It was an achievement. And for those who did not achieve it, the outcome was not punishment but erasure, which was, in the end, what the Egyptians feared most, what all the elaborate apparatus of their funerary culture was designed to prevent, that a human being, who had lived and loved and worked and felt, should simply vanish without remainder into the same undifferentiated nothing from which the universe had arisen in the beginning. For those whose hearts balanced, the scale of Ma'at announced them justified. The word was spoken, Masaikeru, true of voice, right of voice, the verdict of a tribunal that had weighed the whole of a life and found it worthy. Horus presented the vindicated dead to Osiris, and Osiris welcomed them into the realm of the blessed, the field of reeds, the Aru, that Egyptian paradise which was, with characteristic practicality, imagined as an idealized version of the life just left behind. Not a transcendent realm of pure spirit, not a cloud-surrounded abstraction, but a place where the grain grew taller than it ever did on earth, and the Nile was always at the perfect flood, and the weather was mild, and one's family was present, and the work of the hands was satisfying and not too hard, and the offerings on the offering table were always fresh. The Egyptians were not romantic about paradise. They were not, in the main, interested in a heaven that bore no resemblance to the life they knew. What they wanted was the life they knew, but better. The same world, but without the grief and loss and difficulty. The same river, but always perfectly behaved. The same fields, but always fruitful. The same family, but no longer subject to death. It was a thoroughly human vision of the eternal, and it gives the Egyptian afterlife its particular warmth, this sense that what the dead were being preserved for was not some unimaginable transcendence, but an enhanced continuation, a version of themselves still recognizably themselves, in a world still recognizably the world, just freed from the constraints that made the mortal version so hard. And yet the Egyptians understood, at the deepest level of their theology, that existence was not static. Even paradise was not a fixed condition but a dynamic one, embedded in the same great cycle that governed everything else. Because the souls in the field of reeds existed in the same cosmos as the living, subject to the same rhythms, connected to the same divine machinery. Ra's solar bark passed through the Duat every night, and those souls greeted it in the darkness, their voices the ones that called out Ra's names as the bark moved through the underworld hours. They were part of the great machinery of existence, the renewed dead contributing their voices and their energy to the cosmic effort of maintaining Ma'at, just as the living contributed their labor and their offerings. The cycle was everything. The Egyptians returned to this again and again, in their architecture and their art and their texts and their rituals, the cycle of the sun, the cycle of the Nile, the cycle of life and death and rebirth. The great turning wheel of existence in which nothing was ever finally lost, because everything that ended became the seed of its own renewal. The sun dies every evening and is reborn every morning. The Nile floods and destroys, and then recedes and leaves behind the black silt from which everything grows. Osiris is murdered and dismembered and restored and becomes, in his death, something greater than he was in his life, the Lord of eternal existence, the God through whose resurrection all human resurrection is possible. Horus is born in hiding and endangered and grows to claim his throne, and the claiming of the throne is the reassertion of righteous order against the usurpation of chaos. And then the pharaoh dies and becomes Osiris, and the new pharaoh ascends and becomes Horus, and the drama plays again, never identical but always recognizable, the same deep pattern wearing different faces in different centuries. The Egyptians gave this cyclical principle a name, Nihe, endless cyclical time, the time of repetition and renewal, the time of the seasons and the floods and the astronomical cycles and the generations of human life. It was different from Jet, linear time, the time of permanence and fixity, the eternal present in which the gods existed and in which the properly blessed dead would eventually come to participate. These were not opposing principles, but complementary ones, the cycling wheel and the still axle around which it turns, Nihe the turning and Jet the eternal, the dance and the dancer, the river and its bed. What is remarkable is how consciously the Egyptians maintained both of these orientations simultaneously. They did not, in the manner of some traditions, try to escape the wheel of time, did not understand the repetitive cycles of nature as something to be transcended, a prison to be broken out of in the direction of some pure unchanging eternity. Instead, they participated fully in the cycles, celebrated them, built their whole civilization around them, and sought to find within the cycling the eternal, to discover, at the still center of the turning world, the unchanging principle that made the turning possible. That still center was Ma'at. Ma'at was both the standard against which the heart was weighed and the principle that the heart should have embodied in life. She was the measure and the thing being measured. She was the feather and the scale. She was the rightness of things in their proper places, and she was what you were trying to become when you chose, in the small daily decisions of a human life, honesty over deception, generosity over greed, kindness over cruelty. The Egyptians did not imagine this was easy. The myths are full of failures, of gods who do the wrong thing and humans who do the wrong thing and the complicated consequences that follow. Osiris is dead. Horus grows up fatherless. Isis wanders the marshes grieving. Set, for all his eventual repositioning as the defender of Ra, carries forever the knowledge of what he did. The world is not a simple place, and the mythology that describes it does not pretend otherwise. What it offers instead is the possibility of response, the possibility that even in the face of the worst thing, something generative can occur. That grief can become purpose. That love can function in the dark. That what has been scattered can, with infinite patience and fierce will, be gathered back. In the millennia after the great age of Egyptian civilization, as the Persian conquest came and the Greek Ptolemaic dynasty succeeded it, and the Romans eventually absorbed Egypt into their world-spanning empire, the myths did not simply disappear. They transformed. They were carried by travelers and traders and soldiers and slaves and pilgrims across the Mediterranean and beyond. Isis became one of the most widely worshipped goddesses of the Greco-Roman world, her temples built from Britain to Afghanistan. Her mysteries celebrated by people who did not speak a word of ancient Egyptian, but who recognized in her story something that spoke to them at a level below language. The image of Isis nursing the child Horus, that tender image from the marshes, the divine mother holding her endangered son, traveled across centuries and cultures and theological transformations and left traces that are still visible in our world. Osiris entered the Greek imagination as Serapis, a hybrid deity that blended the Egyptian lord of the dead with Greek traditions of divine sovereignty and suffering and renewal. And the resulting cult spread through the Hellenistic world with a power that suggests it was meeting a need that purely Greek religion had not quite addressed, the need for a god who had suffered, who understood mortality from the inside, who had been betrayed and dismembered and restored, and who therefore knew the territory of human grief and human hope in a way that the Olympians, serene on their mountain, did not. The idea of the weighing of the soul, that final accounting in which the whole of a life is measured against the standard of divine justice, moved through Jewish and Christian and Islamic theology in forms that are recognizable if you know what to look for. The imagery shifting, but the deep structure remaining, a judgment after death, a moral accounting, a cosmic distinction between those who have lived well and those who have not. The pyramids remain. They will remain, almost certainly, long after everything built by our own civilization has returned to dust, because the Egyptians understood something about permanence that we have perhaps forgotten, that things made with the full weight of meaning, made as expressions of the deepest convictions a culture holds about what matters and why, made with the understanding that they are participating in something larger than any individual life, have a durability that purely functional objects cannot match. The pyramids were not built to be useful in any ordinary sense. They were built to be true. And truth, it turns out, lasts. But the physical monuments are, in a sense, the least of what Egypt left behind. What Egypt left behind was a way of thinking about existence, a framework for understanding the universe that took its full complexity seriously, that refused to simplify the divine into a single principle or a single story, that insisted on holding contradictions together rather than resolving them artificially, that saw in the most ordinary natural phenomena the rise and fall of a river, the arc of the sun, the growth of grain from black earth, the working out of truths so deep that they could only be expressed in story. The Nile still floods in its modified modern way. The sun still rises and sets over the desert cliffs that line the valley, still turns the limestone to amber in the evening light, still illuminates those enormous faces carved into the rock at Abu Simbel. The face of Ramesses II still gazing eastward at the dawn with that expression that is not quite human and not quite divine, that is both at once, that is exactly what the pharaoh was supposed to be. The stars still will over the Giza Plateau on winter nights, and the 3 stars of Orion's belt still hold their alignment with the 3 pyramids as they did 4,500 years ago when the ground was being prepared and the first massive blocks were being set. Something about this continuity is important. The Egyptians believed in the eternal cycle because they experienced it, because the evidence of their senses confirmed year after year that the world did renew itself, that death was followed by return, that the sun always came back. They were not making a leap of faith so much as drawing a theological conclusion from a pattern that was empirically available to anyone who paid attention for long enough. The universe, they observed, does not prefer endings. The universe prefers cycles. Things transform. Things recur. The pattern that has always happened continues to happen, and the name of that pattern, its deepest name, is something they called by many names across the millennia, Ra, Osiris, Maat, but which we might simply call the way things are. There is a passage in one of the ancient Egyptian wisdom texts, the kind of text that a scribe would copy as an exercise, that a father might offer to a son as guidance for living. That speaks about the relationship between action and eternity, with a simplicity that cuts through the centuries like a ray of Egyptian morning light. It says, in essence, do not despise the small things. The feather is small. The heart that balances against it must be equally small in its way, free of the heaviness of malice and deception, light with the consistent practice of right conduct in unremarkable circumstances. The gods do not ask for heroism in every moment. They ask for honesty. They ask for the farmer to mark his boundary correctly, for the merchant to use accurate weights, for the official to hear the case of the poor man with the same attention he gives to the wealthy one. They ask for the ordinary practice of fairness that, accumulated over a lifetime, produces the feather-light heart that balances the scale. This is not a small teaching. It is, in its way, as sophisticated a moral philosophy as anything produced by the Greek tradition that would follow it, or the philosophical traditions of any civilization. The conviction that ethics is primarily a matter of accumulated ordinary choices rather than grand dramatic gestures, that the quality of a life is determined mostly by what you do on unremarkable Tuesdays rather than in the crises that define themselves as important. This is a genuine insight into the nature of moral life. And it was arrived at by people who were asking the question not in seminars, but in the context of an actual judgment they expected to face. The great story of Egyptian mythology, the story that runs from Nun to Osiris to Horus to the Pharaoh to every ordinary dead person standing before the scales of judgment, is, at its heart, a story about a universe that wants to be good. Not a universe that is good, not a paradise in which evil is absent, but a universe that has a deep tendency toward order and balance and truth. A universe that punishes violations of its nature not out of spite, but out of the same necessity that makes water run downhill. Ma'at is not an external imposition on a chaos that would otherwise be free. Ma'at is the grain of the universe itself, the way things actually are beneath all the noise and violence and apparent randomness of experience. Set killed Osiris. That happened. The dismemberment happened. The long grief of Isis in the marshes happened, and the dangerous childhood of Horus happened, and the 80-year legal battle happened. None of it was simple, none of it was painless, and the resolution, when it came, was not a restoration of what had existed before. Osiris did not return to his throne. The world that existed after Set's crime was not the same world that existed before. Some things, once broken, cannot be unbroken. But something could be salvaged from the breaking. Osiris, in his new state, his posthumous state, became something that the living Osiris, the good king, the teacher of civilization, the beloved husband, could never have been, the guarantor of every human hope of life after death. The living proof that death is not an ending but a threshold, the one who had been through the worst that existence can offer and had come out the other side as something more profound than what he had been before. His murder was not redeemed, it remained a crime, remained Set's fault, remained a violation of Ma'at that even the tribunal's final judgment could not entirely repair. But it was transformed. The worst thing became, through the alchemy of Isis's love and the magic of Anubis and the wisdom of Thoth, the source of the greatest hope. This is perhaps the deepest claim of Egyptian mythology, the claim that underlies the whole extraordinary edifice, that the universe is structured in such a way that even the worst thing can be redeemed. Not reversed. The Egyptians were too honest for that, too rooted in the actual texture of experience to pretend that lost things are not lost, but redeemed, transformed into the substance of something new. The scattered pieces of the god becoming the seeds of the resurrection, the murder of the king becoming the birth of the god of eternal life, the grief of the wife becoming the most powerful magic in existence. Isis is still walking. She walks through the reeds at the edge of the river, her hair unbound, her dress torn, her eyes scanning the surface of the water and the dark banks and the trembling papyrus. She has been walking since the beginning of recorded human thought about what love is and what it can do. She walks in every mother sitting at a bedside, in every person refusing to accept the finality of a loss, in every act of reconstruction that follows destruction, in every hand gathering up the pieces of something that has been broken and beginning. with infinite patience and fierce will, the work of putting it back together. The sun rises. It rises over the desert cliffs and the limestone plateau and the black silt of the river valley and the ancient city of the dead and the living city above it. The light moves across the face of the Sphinx, that great inscrutable keeper of the plateau, half human and half lion, eternally watchful, neither speaking nor quite silent. The shadow moves. The temperature rises. The day begins again. Ra is crossing the sky in his bark. The crew watches the horizon. In the deep hours of tonight, when the bark descends below the western edge of the world and enters the dark hours, Apophis will coil in the black water, and Set will drive his spear, and the crew will pull their oars and speak their words of power. And somewhere in the 6th hour the great god of the living will meet the great god of the dead in the silent center of the darkness, and they will recognize each other, and for one suspended moment they will be one, the living and the dead, the light and the dark, the going and the coming, all of it held in a single divine embrace at the heart of the night. And then the bark will move on. The last hour of darkness will open into the serpent's great mouth. And the sun, newly made, carrying within it the memory of its death and its renewal, will rise. It has always risen. It rises still. The feather waits. The scale is balanced. The heart, if it has been well lived in, finds its weight equal to the truth. And the voice that has been true of voice in life is declared true of voice in death, and the field of reeds opens, and the river runs through it, and the grain stands tall and gold in the eternal morning. And somewhere near the water's edge an ibis is writing in the mud with its curved beak, recording what it finds there, as it always has, as it always will, the faithful secretary of an existence that refuses to be lost.